In the winter of 1973, American drivers sat for hours in lines that wrapped around city blocks, waiting for gas that some stations simply ran out of before their turn came. 35 years later, in the summer of 2008, there were no lines, just a number on the sign at the pump that kept climbing every time you looked at it. Two completely different scenes, two generations apart, one gradual and one sudden, one caused by an embargo and the other by a speculative run to a record high. Both were the opening act of a recession. In between those two moments and in the decades since, the same basic story has played out again and again, in different countries, under different governments, with different weapons of choice: an embargo, a revolution, an invasion, a speculative price run, but with an ending that rarely changes. That's not a coincidence, and it isn't just those two. 9 of the last 10 recessions in the United States were preceded by a sudden spike in the price of oil. Not 5, not 7, 9 out of 10. According to research from James Hamilton, the economist who has spent more of his career studying this relationship than almost anyone alive, going back over 4 decades of research on a single, recurring question: why does the same commodity keep showing up right before the American economy breaks? Every recession needs something that actually pulls the trigger. This video is the autopsy of the one commodity that has pulled it more often than anything else in modern economic history, and the specific mechanism, 3 steps long, by which a barrel of oil turns into a nationwide slowdown in country after country, decade after decade, almost without exception. 4 separate episodes prove it. One number tested against decades of data confirms it. And one recent exception shows exactly what it takes to break a pattern this consistent. A pattern that, until 2022, had held for essentially the entire post-war era without a single, genuine reprieve. To understand why an oil price spike does so much damage to an economy that has nothing directly to do with drilling or refining, it helps to trace the effect through 3 separate channels, each one straightforward on its own, that combine into something much larger than the sum of its parts. None of these 3 channels is exotic or theoretical. Each one shows up in slightly different proportions in every one of the 4 historical episodes this video is about to walk through. The first channel is what amounts to a sudden, unlegislated tax. Oil isn't just what goes into a car's gas tank. It's an input into nearly everything: the diesel that moves freight across the country, the jet fuel that powers air travel, the plastic and chemical feedstocks running through half of modern manufacturing, the natural gas and heating oil warming homes through the winter. When the price of a barrel of oil doubles, it doesn't just raise the price at the pump, it raises costs simultaneously across a huge share of the entire economy, all at once, with no warning and no vote in Congress. Money that would otherwise go toward a family's groceries, a company's new hire, or a small business's expansion instead gets redirected straight into an energy bill. And worse, for an oil-importing country, a meaningful share of that redirected money doesn't even stay in the domestic economy. It leaves the country entirely, flowing to whichever oil-producing nations happen to be selling at the moment. A tax legislated by Congress at least keeps the money inside the country to be spent or redistributed domestically. A price spike sends a meaningful share of it overseas instead, which is precisely why the 1973 embargo felt so different and so much more painful than an ordinary domestic tax increase of the same size would have. The second channel is a sectoral shock rather than an economy-wide one. An oil price spike doesn't hit every industry equally. It hits certain sectors first, hardest, and almost immediately: automobile manufacturing, airlines, and heavy industry chief among them. James Hamilton's own research on the 2008 shock found that a substantial share of that particular recession traced directly back to a collapse in automobile production, as gasoline prices climbing toward $4 a gallon pushed American consumers away from the larger, less fuel-efficient vehicles that had been the most profitable segment of the domestic auto industry for years. An economy doesn't need every sector to shrink at once to tip into recession. It just needs a large enough sector to shrink hard and fast enough, and the auto industry, hit at exactly its most vulnerable margin, has played that role again and again across multiple decades and multiple entirely different oil shocks. Airlines face a similarly direct hit, since jet fuel is one of their largest single operating costs, and heavy industries running energy-intensive manufacturing processes see their input costs rise before almost anyone else in the broader economy even notices a change at the pump. The third channel is the one that turns a cost shock into a full recession, rather than just an uncomfortable few quarters of higher prices. The response from the Federal Reserve, an oil spike, is inflationary, almost by definition. It raises the price of nearly everything, all at once. A central bank facing that kind of inflation has a well-worn playbook. Raise interest rates to cool demand and bring prices back under control. That response makes sense on its own terms, and central banks would face justified criticism for ignoring inflation that severe. It's also the step that turns a cost shock into an actual recession, because higher interest rates slow down exactly the borrowing and spending. An economy needs to keep growing through a difficult patch. This is where the debate about oil shocks actually gets interesting, and this video will return to it directly in Block 6. One more connection is worth making explicit before the case studies begin, because it ties directly to a companion investigation this channel has already published. Oil is the trigger, but the debt already sitting on the economy's books before the shock arrives is what decides how much damage that trigger actually does. A price spike landing on a lightly indebted economy stings. The same spike landing on an economy already leveraged to its limit. The way this channel documented in its investigation of the credit cycle can break it outright. Keep that distinction in mind, because it resurfaces directly in the fourth case study this video is about to cover. The one episode where these two mechanisms, oil and debt, operate on the same economy at the same time. With all three channels laid out, the four historical episodes that follow aren't meant to be read as four separate, disconnected stories. They're four applications of the same underlying mechanism, tested against four different decades, four different geopolitical triggers, and four different responses from the Federal Reserve. A natural experiment repeated often enough that any one episode alone would be interesting, but all four together become something closer to proof. Each one starts with an external shock nobody inside the American economy controlled. Each one runs through the same three channels, and each one ends, within a matter of months, in a recession that economists would later formally date and measure, with unemployment figures, GDP contractions, and stock market losses all pointing back to the same originating spike in a single global commodity. The modern era of oil-triggered recessions begins in October 1973, when OPEC's Arab member states imposed an embargo on oil exports to the United States and other nations perceived as supporting Israel during the Yom Kippur War. It was the first time the world had seen an oil-producing cartel wield its supply as an explicit geopolitical weapon against a major economic power, and the price response was staggering. Crude oil went from roughly $2.90 a barrel in October 1973 to $11.65 by January 1974, an increase of more than 300% in under 4 months. For American consumers who had spent the post-war decades treating cheap, abundant gasoline as close to a birthright, the sudden scarcity was as psychologically jarring as the price itself. Television footage of mile-long lines at gas stations, odd-even rationing based on license plate numbers, and stations running completely dry became some of the defining images of the entire decade. The recession that followed, dated by the National Bureau of Economic Research from November 1973 to March 1975, was at the time one of the most severe downturns of the entire post-war period. Unemployment climbed to 9% by May 1975. Roughly 2.3 million jobs were lost, a post-war record at the time. The American stock market fell right alongside the real economy. The S&P 500 declined by roughly 48% between January 1973 and October 1974, one of the worst bear markets in the index's history, driven by a toxic combination of the oil shock itself, double-digit inflation, and the political chaos of Watergate unfolding in the same stretch of months. With President Nixon's resignation in August 1974 landing squarely in the middle of the worst of the downturn. What made 1973 to 74 such a clean proof of concept for the mechanism described in Block 2 is how directly the sequence played out. A supply shock from an external cartel, an immediate and massive price spike, a squeeze on consumer and business spending across the entire economy simultaneously, and a recession that followed within weeks. There was no ambiguity about the direction of causation. The embargo came first, the price spike came second, and the recession came third, all within a matter of months. It was the first time in the post-war era that Americans learned, in the most direct way possible, that a decision made by foreign oil ministers thousands of miles away could put their own jobs at risk, regardless of anything happening inside their own economy's borders. The damage wasn't confined to the United States either. The embargo and the price spike that followed hit every major oil-importing economy at once. Western Europe and Japan, arguably even more dependent on imported oil than the United States at the time, went through their own parallel recessions on almost the same timeline. That simultaneity is itself a clue about how the mechanism actually works. This wasn't a uniquely American policy failure or a uniquely American vulnerability. It was a shared exposure that every major industrialized economy carried at the same time, because every major industrialized economy ran on the same imported commodity, priced in the same global market, controlled by the same small group of producing nations. The embargo formally ended in March 1974, but oil prices never fell back anywhere close to their pre-embargo level. The new, higher price became the new baseline the entire global economy had to adjust to going forward. That lesson didn't stick as firmly as it should have. Within 6 years, almost the exact same sequence would repeat, this time triggered not by a coordinated embargo, but by a single country's revolution. If 1973 had been treated as a genuine warning rather than a one-time crisis to be weathered and forgotten, American energy policy in the years that followed might have looked very different. It largely wasn't, and it didn't. If you're the kind of person who wants the mechanism, not the headline, that's who this channel is for. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 removed a major oil producer from global markets almost overnight, and even though the actual physical shortfall in supply was modest, global production fell by only a few percentage points. The price reaction was anything but modest. Crude oil climbed from around $15 a barrel in early 1979 to nearly $40 by 1980, more than doubling in barely a year and setting in inflation-adjusted terms one of the highest oil prices in modern history, a level that wouldn't be matched again until the 2008 spike covered later in this video. The gap between the modest physical shortfall and the dramatic price spike is itself revealing. Oil markets don't just price in the barrels actually missing from supply. They price in fear of further disruption, and in 1979, with a revolutionary government in Tehran and the wider Middle East in visible upheaval, that fear alone was enough to nearly triple the price of a barrel of crude within 12 months. This episode produced not one recession, but two. A short, sharp downturn from January to July 1980, followed by a much deeper one running from July 1981 to November 1982. Unemployment eventually peaked at 10.8% in the final weeks of 1982, the highest rate since the Great Depression, and a level the United States would not see again until 2008. Entire industries tied to energy-intensive manufacturing and construction were devastated. Auto plants idled workers by the tens of thousands as consumers, facing gasoline lines reminiscent of 1973, abandoned larger vehicles for smaller, more fuel-efficient imports, permanently reshaping the American auto market. This is the episode where the third mechanism from Block 2, the interest rate amplifier, becomes impossible to miss. Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker, appointed in 1979 specifically to break the back of the runaway inflation. The oil shock had helped pushed the federal funds rate to roughly 20% by mid-1981, with the prime rate banks charged their best customers climbing to 21.5% around the same time. Those are not typos. Home mortgages, business loans, and car financing all became almost prohibitively expensive across the entire country, nearly overnight, by design. Volcker's own public position was blunt. Inflation had to be broken, whatever the short-term cost to employment and growth. The cost turned out to be the worst unemployment rate in half a century, concentrated especially hard in interest rate-sensitive industries like home building and auto manufacturing that had nothing directly to do with oil at all. Farmers whose loans were similarly rate-sensitive staged tractor protests in Washington as agricultural land values collapsed under the weight of borrowing costs that had, within a couple of years, more than doubled. Notice the sequence, because it's the clearest illustration in this entire video of how the mechanism actually compounds. The oil shock created inflation. The Federal Reserve's response to that inflation was what actually delivered the recession's worst damage. Both things are true at once. The oil shock lit the fuse. Volcker's rate hikes were the hand that let it detonate. That distinction, trigger versus amplifier, is the exact debate this video will return to directly in Block 6, because it's not a footnote. It's close to the central question this entire thesis has to answer honestly, and the shift in consumer preference towards smaller, more fuel-efficient cars that started during this episode never fully reversed. It permanently opened the American market to Japanese automakers in a way that reshaped the entire domestic auto industry for the following 4 decades, a legacy of the 1979 shock that long outlasted the recession itself. The pattern repeated again in 1990, this time on a shorter timeline than either of the 2 previous episodes, against a backdrop where American policymakers, having already lived through 2 oil-driven recessions in the previous 17 years, understood almost immediately what an invasion of a major Gulf oil producer was likely to mean for energy markets. When Iraq invaded Kuwait on August 2, 1990, oil prices jumped from around $17 a barrel in July to $36 by October, briefly touching a peak near $46 as markets priced in the risk of a wider Middle Eastern war disrupting supply from the region that mattered most to global production. The invasion put roughly a fifth of the world's proven oil reserves between Kuwait and Iraq combined under the direct control of a single unpredictable regime, and markets reacted to that risk long before any actual barrel of oil failed to ship. The spike was driven as much by fear of what might happen next as by any physical shortfall that had already occurred. The recession that followed, dated by the NBER from July 1990 to March 1991, lasted only about 8 months, the shortest of the 4 episodes in this video, but it followed the exact same shape as 1973 and 1979. A geopolitical shock in the world's most oil-sensitive region, an immediate price spike, and a recession within weeks of the invasion itself. The NBER's own dating committee, in its formal announcement of the recession's start, placed the peak of economic activity squarely in the 3rd quarter of 1990, the same quarter Iraqi tanks rolled into Kuwait. 3 different decades, 3 different geopolitical triggers, an Arab oil embargo, an Iranian revolution, an Iraqi invasion, and in every case the same sequence played out with almost mechanical consistency. A shock in the oil-producing world, an immediate price spike, and an American recession within weeks or months. What's notable about 1990 in particular is how quickly markets and policymakers alike recognized the pattern from the 2 earlier episodes. There was little debate at the time about whether an oil-driven downturn was coming. because the country had now watched this exact sequence play out twice before within a single generation. Recognizing the pattern in advance didn't prevent the recession. It simply meant nobody was surprised when it arrived. Oil hit a nominal record of $145 a barrel on July 3, 2008, the fourth episode in this video, and the one where the mechanism reaches its most extreme scale, intersecting directly with the other investigation this channel has already published. That number dwarfs every previous episode in this video, even after accounting for inflation, and it arrived after a multi-year climb. Rather than a single, sudden shock, oil had been rising steadily for years as global demand, particularly from China's rapidly industrializing economy, ran up against a supply system that struggled to keep pace before the final speculative surge in the first half of 2008 pushed prices to their eventual peak. James Hamilton's own research on this specific period reached a conclusion that's worth stating precisely because it's more surgical than a simple correlation. Without the decline in auto sector production, driven by gasoline prices approaching $4 a gallon, it would have been difficult to characterize the period from the fourth quarter of 2007 through the third quarter of 2008 as a recession at all. Hamilton's own counterfactual estimate was that, absent the oil shock, the American economy would likely have been growing slowly, but not contracting. That's a striking claim on its own terms. One of the most severe recessions in modern American history, according to one of the field's most careful researchers, might not have been a recession at all in its early stages without the specific contribution of oil, a conclusion that reframes 2008 not purely as a story about Wall Street, but as a story where an energy shock and a financial system already weakened by years of excessive borrowing happened to collide in the same unlucky year. That distinction matters enormously for how 2008 gets remembered. The popular story is subprime mortgages and Lehman Brothers, and that story is correct. But it's a story about what turned a recession into a full-blown financial crisis, not necessarily what tipped the economy into recession in the first place. While Hamilton's research suggests the oil shock did that specific job on its own, months before Lehman Brothers failed in September 2008. This is the exact intersection this channel flagged in its investigation of the credit cycle. Household debt was the balloon, already stretched to its limit by 2007. The oil shock was the pin. Both mechanisms were operating on the same economy in the same months, and untangling exactly how much damage belongs to each one is genuinely difficult, which is precisely why the next block takes that difficulty seriously instead of glossing over it. It's also worth noting how quickly the oil side of that story reversed. After peaking at $145 in July, oil collapsed to under $40 a barrel by the end of 2008, as the financial crisis that followed crushed global demand, meaning the same commodity that likely helped trigger the downturn also became one of its most visible casualties within a matter of months. A reminder that the relationship between oil and the broader economy runs in both directions at once, not just from oil prices toward growth. A thesis built on 4 historical episodes owes its audience an honest answer to the most obvious challenge. Is it really the oil, or is it actually the Federal Reserve's response to the oil that does the damage? This isn't an abstract academic quibble. It goes directly to the heart of what this video has been arguing since Block 2, and any investigation that skipped past it would be presenting a thesis stronger than the evidence actually supports. Economists Ben Bernanke, Mark Gertler, and Mark Watson took that question seriously in an influential 1997 paper, and their finding complicates the simple version of this video's thesis in a genuinely useful way. When they model a counterfactual in which the Federal Reserve chose not to tighten monetary policy in response to an oil shock, a large share of that shock's recessionary impact simply disappeared from their model. In other words, a meaningful part of the damage in episodes like 1979 to 82 came not from the oil price increase itself, but from the interest rate response to it. Their research suggested that a central bank willing to look past the inflationary spike, rather than fighting it aggressively with higher rates, could, in principle, avoid turning an oil shock into a full recession at all. This video's position, worked out honestly rather than defensively, is that this finding doesn't undermine the thesis, it sharpens it. Oil is the trigger. The interest rate response is the finger that pulls it. A trigger with no finger on it doesn't fire, which is a fair point. But a gun with no trigger doesn't fire either. The oil shock creates the inflationary pressure that all but forces a central bank's hand. The central bank's hand is what actually delivers the recession. Both parts of that sequence are necessary. Neither one on its own is sufficient. That's not a retreat from the thesis. It's the honest version of it, and it's also worth noting that a central bank choosing not to respond to double-digit inflation carries its own serious risks. Runaway inflation expectations, a collapsing currency, a wage price spiral that no responsible policymaker could simply ignore. The Bernanke-Gertler-Watson finding doesn't hand central banks an easy alternative. It just clarifies which part of the pain in each historical episode came from which source, and it's precisely this kind of academic pushback, taken seriously rather than dismissed, that separates a rigorous investigation from a channel simply repeating a convenient talking point. The second challenge to this video's thesis is more recent and arguably more serious because it's not a matter of academic reinterpretation. It's a real-world case where the old pattern simply stopped showing up. The shale revolution, which took off in the United States roughly between 2010 and 2015, transformed the country from one of the world's largest oil importers into one of its largest producers, fundamentally changing who benefits and who suffers when oil prices move. Advances in hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling unlocked reserves in shale formations across Texas, North Dakota, and elsewhere that had been considered commercially unreachable just a decade earlier. And American crude production roughly doubled over the following 10 years, eventually making the United States the largest oil producer in the world, ahead of both Saudi Arabia and Russia. Between 2014 and 2016, oil prices collapsed by roughly 70%, and instead of delivering the economic boost that a large drop in energy costs would have been expected to provide under the old, import-dependent model, the effect on the broader American economy was muted, because by that point, a large and growing share of the country's own economic activity was tied to oil production itself, an industry that a price collapse actively hurts rather than helps. Oil-producing states like Texas and North Dakota saw real, localized downturns during that period, even as the national economy as a whole barely noticed the price collapse that, decades earlier, would have been treated as unambiguous good news for every American household. The World Bank's own analysis of that period concluded the drop reflected a genuine shift in the global supply picture, driven substantially by the same American shale production that was simultaneously changing how much any given price move actually mattered to the U.S. economy as a whole. Put simply, the same shale boom that made oil price crashes less obviously beneficial also, as the next block will show, made oil price spikes less obviously damaging. Two sides of the same structural shift. If a channel willing to test its own thesis against the cases where it stops working cleanly is the kind of investigation you want delivered every week, subscribing is the easiest way to catch the next one. We publish a new documented economic autopsy on a regular schedule, back to the ledger and to the exception that matters most. Here is the number that turns 4 historical episodes into a documented, statistically tested pattern. 4 case studies, however carefully chosen, are still just 4 stories, compelling on their own, but the kind of evidence a careful viewer is right to want tested against something broader than a curated set of examples this video happened to walk through, especially given how much weight this video's central thesis has placed on them. James Hamilton, an economist at the University of California, San Diego, has spent more of his career studying the relationship between oil and the broader economy than perhaps anyone else alive, going back to his foundational 1983 paper, Oil and the Macroeconomy Since World War II, and continuing through decades of subsequent research, refining the same question. His conclusion, repeated and tested across multiple decades of data, 9 of the last 10 recessions in the United States were preceded by a sharp spike in the price of oil. That's not a loose historical observation. Hamilton's statistical work found that a 4-quarter lag in the price of oil is a meaningful predictor of subsequent GDP growth with a level of statistical significance. A t-statistic of negative 2.4, a p-value around 0.005, that would satisfy the standards of a formal academic paper in any empirical economics journal. Translated out of statistical language, the relationship between oil price spikes and subsequent economic slowdowns is not something that shows up by chance in a small sample. It's a pattern robust enough to clear the bar economists use to distinguish a real signal from statistical noise, tested against decades of quarterly economic data rather than a handful of cherry-picked examples. Line the 4 episodes from this video up against that statistical finding, and each one becomes a specific illustration of the same underlying regularity, rather than an isolated anecdote. 1973 fits the pattern. 1979 to 82 fits the pattern, twice over, producing 2 separate recessions from the same oil shock. 1990 fits the pattern. In 2008, according to Hamilton's own specific research into that episode, fits the pattern closely enough that he explicitly argued the oil shock deserved to be counted among the recessions his broader statistical relationship was built to explain, rather than treated as a pure financial crisis outlier with no connection to energy prices at all. Other researchers working independently of Hamilton, using different statistical methods and different time windows, have arrived at broadly similar conclusions about the predictive power of oil price movements. This isn't a finding that rests on one economist's particular choice of model specification, even though Hamilton's own body of work remains the most extensive single treatment of the question. It's worth including Hamilton's own honesty about the limits of his finding, because a channel built in investigative rigor doesn't get to cite the parts of the research that help the thesis while quietly skipping the parts that complicate it. Hamilton's own later work found that the relationship weakens and becomes less consistent when the data is extended much further past 2005. He's described it in his own research as nonlinear and in some specifications unstable rather than a clean, unchanging law of economics that holds exactly the same way in every decade. That caveat doesn't erase the 9 out of 10 finding. It's a reminder that even the strongest empirical pattern in macroeconomics comes with edges where it gets fuzzier, and pretending otherwise would be exactly the kind of overclaiming this channel tries to avoid. And, as the next block will show, that fuzziness at the edges is exactly where the story gets more interesting, not less. A researcher willing to publish the exact conditions under which his own famous finding starts to break down is doing something rarer and more valuable than a researcher who simply repeats a strong result without ever stress testing it against newer data. 9 of the last 10 recessions, not a coincidence repeating 9 times running, an economist's entire career's worth of research tested against decades of data, arriving at the same number 9 separate times. Right before the American economy broke, the price of oil had just spiked. That's the number this entire video has been building toward, and it's the number the final block is going to test against the one recent case where the pattern didn't hold. The case that, more than any of the 4 historical episodes already covered, actually explains why understanding the mechanism matters more than simply memorizing the statistic. Go back to where this video started. A gas line in 1973, a climbing number at the pump in 2008, 35 years apart, both announcing a recession that hadn't quite arrived yet. For 50 years, that pattern held with remarkable consistency. The trigger changed shape each time, from an Arab embargo to an Iranian revolution to an Iraqi invasion to a speculative run toward $145 a barrel. But the sequence that followed barely varied at all. A shock, a spike, a squeeze on consumers and businesses, an inflationary response from the Federal Reserve, and a recession within months. 4 episodes, 4 different decades, 4 different parts of the world where the actual trigger originated. And, according to Hamilton's own statistical work, 7 more recessions beyond the 4 this video covered in detail, all fitting the same 9 out of 10 pattern. Then, in 2022, the pattern broke, and the reason it broke tells you almost everything about how the American economy has actually changed since Hamilton first started studying this relationship 4 decades ago. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Brent crude briefly spiked to nearly $140 a barrel in early March, the highest level since the 2008 shock covered in Block 5, before settling closer to $128 in the days that followed. By every historical pattern this video has traced, that kind of spike should have been the opening act of another American recession. It wasn't. The United States, transformed by the shale revolution into one of the world's largest oil producers rather than one of its largest importers, absorbed the shock in a way that would have been structurally impossible in 1973, 1979, 1990, or even 2008. A single striking exception standing against 50 years of near-perfect consistency. That's not proof the mechanism from this video stopped working. It's proof the mechanism depends on a condition that used to be a constant and no longer is. Whether the country experiencing the price spike is a net importer paying the tax described in Block 2, or a net producer partially collecting it instead. The trigger didn't disappear in 2022. The geography of who gets hurt by pulling it changed. American oil and gas producers, who would have been irrelevant bystanders to a price spike in any of the previous 4 episodes, actually benefited from higher revenue in 2022, money that stayed inside the domestic economy rather than flowing overseas the way it did after the 1973 embargo, partially offsetting the pain still felt at gas pumps in states with no oil production of their own. That offsetting effect simply didn't exist as a structural feature of the American economy in 1973, 1979, or 1990. There was no domestic oil boom large enough to counterbalance the pain importers felt at the pump, which is precisely why this video's 4th mechanism, the interest rate amplifier, had nothing standing in its way in any of those 3 earlier episodes. In 2022, for the first time in this video's entire timeline, a meaningful share of the country's exposure to a spike in oil prices came with an offsetting benefit built directly into the same national economy. That leaves an open question this channel can't answer with the same confidence as the 9 out of 10 statistic from Block 7, precisely because the shale era is still young enough that it hasn't been tested by nearly as many separate oil shocks as the 50 years that came before it. Is the old pattern permanently broken or simply dormant, waiting for a shock large enough or a shift back toward import dependence significant enough to reassert itself the way it did 9 times out of the last 10? Nobody, including Hamilton himself, claims to know that yet, with the same confidence as the historical record already covered in this video. A single data point, 1 shock, 1 non-recession, is nowhere near enough to overturn a pattern built on 9 separate episodes across 50 years. It's enough to note as a genuine, honest exception. It is not enough to declare the entire mechanism obsolete, and treating a single, favorable data point as proof of a permanent structural shift is exactly the kind of overclaiming this channel has tried to avoid at every step of this investigation. What's certain is the mechanism underneath all 4 historical episodes in this video. Energy is an input into nearly everything. A sudden spike in its price acts like an unlegislated tax on every household and business at once, and the interest rate response that follows usually turns a painful quarter into a full recession. That mechanism hasn't been repealed. It's just currently being tested by a country that, for the first time in the 50 years this video has covered, has some genuine insulation against its own trigger. Insulation that could just as easily erode again if domestic production patterns shift, or if a future shock proves large enough to overwhelm even a net producer's advantage, the way even the most resilient economies eventually found their limits tested in 1973, 1979, and 1990. 4 episodes across 5 decades all ended the same way. The 5th so far has not. Whether it stays that way is a question this video leaves open honestly, rather than answering with more confidence than the evidence currently supports. If you want the next documented breakdown of the hidden mechanisms actually driving the headlines, subscribe to Market Autopsy. We publish a new investigation like this every week, and the companion piece on the credit cycle that keeps surfacing throughout this video is already waiting for you if you haven't seen it yet. 2 mechanisms, 1 economy, and a trigger that has pulled 9 times out of the last 10.